to factor this quadratic, we need to solve it for our warm-up. So we started with our x. We saw this was going to be a shorter method because we didn't have our a. We put negative 32 on top, negative 4 on bottom. What were two numbers that we came up with? Negative 6. So negative 6 times 6 will give you 36. 8 and 4. How can we use those to get negative 4 and negative 32? Negative 8 and then, sorry, positive 4. So a negative times a positive will give me a negative, and then negative 4 plus, or negative 8 plus 4 will give me positive, negative 4, I'm sorry, all over the place. So now that I came up with these two numbers, what comes next?
That's your answer, x minus 8 and x plus 4.
So x minus 8 and x plus 4. These are my two factors. And because my original quadratic was equal to 0, these two factors are also equal to 0. But how do I actually solve this now?
Square root it.
Do a square root yet. We square root if we don't have that missing, if we don't have that middle number. If it's just an x squared and just a number, we can use the square root, but not for this one. We can take each factor, we call it the zero product property, and set it equal to 0, then we can solve it. So x minus 8 equals 0. And then x plus 4, so x plus 4 equals 0. So once again, we split it into two problems, because almost always we're typically ending up with two answers. So we need to split up into two problems to get those two answers. And then from here, we just have to solve each of them. So I can add 8, and that gives me x equals positive 8 as one solution. And I can subtract 4, and this is x equals negative 4 as my other solution. So once again, we factored, and then we took each of those factors and set it equal to 0, and then solved each of those equations, and those were two solutions on when our quadratic was equal to 0. Now thinking about our actual quadratic when it was on a graph, what did these answers represent? They were our x-intercepts. Good, Wyatt. So those were our x-intercepts. Those were the points when your quadratic was touching the ground. So if next week, when we start talking about modeling questions, when we're talking about modeling quadratics and looking at quadratics using real-life situations, we're going to look at like projectile motion. So you throw a football and you want to see where the football hits the ground. These x-intercepts are going to be when things are hitting the ground or when things are going to stop moving. So x-intercepts are a big important piece that we're going to end up solving for, especially with projectile motion. And so being able to solve using factoring is one way that we can find those x-intercepts. But sometimes when we factoring can be a lot of work, and sometimes factoring can be annoying. And there's even times where you run into a quadratic where it's not factorable at all. There's just no way you can factor it. Sometimes we encounter that. And so because that's the case, we typically jump to some other, or we want to know some other methods on how to solve your quadratics just besides factoring. So what we're going to look at this week is we're going to look at two other methods on how to solve quadratics besides factoring. But any three of these methods should work. Factoring sometimes doesn't always work, but we'll look at the three methods that can work or that can solve for these x-intercepts of any quadratic. At the end of the week, you might have a preference on which method you prefer. You might prefer factoring, you might prefer quadratic formula, you might prefer complete the square, and that's fine. I still want you to be able to know how to do each of them, but if I just give you a quadratic and tell you to solve it, I don't care which method you necessarily do. I just want you to be able to do it. Sound good so far? All right. Is anyone in a singing mood? I really feel like singing.
Yes,
Okay, I'm gonna sing. Opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a.
This feels very aggressive.
The opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All right, see if you can figure out what this is. The opposite of b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a.
It's root right slope.
Root right slope.
You and maybe I should do it.
You were saying it to us last year, but yeah.
Ruth Wright was the one who would sing this typically last year in algebra class and stuff, but she's not here right now, so I haven't sing it by myself. It's not as good.
Oh.
But once again, it's the opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4.
Oh, over two, so you're singing someone rest.
It's a great song. All right, so let's talk about that. So this is our quadratic formula. So quadratic formula is this big long formula that you can, if you input these values in and solve the formula, they will solve or they'll give you the answer. So rather than having factoring where it's like multiple steps, this is just one big formula where you plug in the numbers, answer the formula, and those will be your solutions. So let's talk about what each of these pieces represent. So earlier last week, we talked about the generic formula for a quadratic. That was ax squared plus bx plus c. That was your a, b, and c were those numbers that represented that. A was the number from the x squared, the b was the number from the x, and then c was that number without any of the exponents or any of the variables in them. So using those numbers, we can pull those numbers from our quadratic and we can put them into this formula to help us solve. So once again, it's the opposite of b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a, or all over 2a. So this is our quadratic formula. It is a lot. It's a big thing to remember. You will receive this quadratic formula on your state test. They will give you a reference sheet, and on the bottom of the reference sheet at the very back is the quadratic formula. That's really the only thing on the reference sheet that's really beneficial to Algebra 1 students. But the quadratic formula is on that test, so you will not have to memorize this, but we will need to know how to use it. Personally, I feel it's easier to have it memorized than having to keep looking back at that reference sheet, so that's why there's that song. So we can always sing that song together, and we can help memorize this quadratic formula together. Ask Grant Reppert about the quadratic formula, and he'll sing it every day. He sings it all the time in class. So, once again, in order to solve this, what you're going to do is you're going to figure out what are those numbers, what's my A, what's my B, what's my C, and then we're going to plug these numbers into this formula, and then we're going to solve this formula. Really, solving the formula is just simplifying it. We have to figure out, okay, what is B squared? What's 4 times A times C? Subtract these two. What's the square root of that whole number? What's B plus or minus these two values? The reason we have that plus or minus here, so the reason we have this weird plus minus symbol, at one point, we're going to get to a point where we're going to have to add the answer and we're going to have to subtract the answer. Just like how when you factor, we always end up with 2 solutions, this plus or minus is going to make sure we get 2 solutions, or almost typically 2 solutions. So at one point, we'll have to be negative b plus whatever the answer to this is divided by 2a, and then we'll do negative b minus the answer to this divided by 2a. It seems like a lot of work, and it kind of is at first, but the more you get used to it, and the quicker we, or the more we factor with it, or the more we find solutions with it, the easier it'll be. At the end of last year, I took a poll to see which students preferred factoring, which students preferred quadratic formula, which students preferred complete the square, and I would say probably 80% of students chose quadratic formula at the end of last year. It's the method I typically use when trying to solve quadratics, and so the more you get used to it, the more we work with it, the easier it will become. So make sure you have this written down on your piece of paper. Once again, it will be given to you on your state test and things like that, but it'll be on a reference sheet, so you have to know when to use it and how to use it. But they'll just give you like this is all you'll receive. Are we okay with that? Do we have this written down, or are we still copying this down? White, are you still getting it? Okay. Opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2.
What's the enthusiasm?
What was that?
You have no enthusiasm. How can you sing a song so aggressively?
I don't know what you mean by aggressive singing.
You're like at the same tone.
Yeah, why don't
like
you
it
sing
feels
it?
like we're really keep singing.
Are we good, White? Okay. So we're going to look at some examples of this. We're going to work together. We're going to use this problem.
Actually, you're really bad singing.
Okay. That's not really working. All right. When we need to solve this, you want to write down 3 pieces of information. You need to figure out what that A, B, and C are from your problem. So when we talk about A, B, and C, though, we are just talking about the number. We do not care about the variables. We do not care about the exponents or anything like that. You just need that coefficient in front. So A is just going to be 2. B is going to be 3.
C is negative.
C is negative 5. So always to start off with these problems, I would write down your A, B, and C to start. So start off with your A, B, and C. And then from here, we get to start with our quadratic formula. Once again, the quadratic formula is opposite of B plus or minus square root B squared minus 4AC
All over A.
all over 2A. And from here, now that we have the A, B, and C, now that we have that formula, we are going to fill in these pieces of information. We're going to fill in what's my B's, what are my A's, what are my C's. And we're just going to take those numbers and plug them in and then simplify this whole answer. So now that we have that quadratic formula, once again, we're going to start plugging in those numbers for each of those variables. So I start off with negative, so I start off with opposite of B, or negative B. I'm just doing the opposite sign of whatever B is. So B currently is 3, so my first term is going to be negative 3, because I want to take the opposite of it, plus or minus the square root of B squared, so 3 squared, minus 4 times A, which is 2, times C, which is negative 5. So 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 5, all divided by 2 times A, which once again is just 2. So once again, the only thing I did so far is I just substituted each of those letters with my numbers that they represent. Are we okay with this so far? It looks like a lot, I understand, but once again, the more we work with it, the easier it'll turn out. So we have x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 5, all divided by 2 times 2. Now, in order to actually solve this, we need to think through order of operations. What do I need to work on first? What do I need to work on next? We can't just sort of like start piece by piece, but we have to think through those order of operations. So thinking order of operations, what comes first? Parentheses or grouping. So we don't necessarily have any parentheses in here, but this square root is grouping all of this under the square root together. We first need to simplify all of that under the square root first, and then we can worry about the stuff outside. So if I need to worry about simplifying what's under the square root, what do I need to do first under this square root?
Subtract.
Think of order of operations, what comes next? Exponents comes next. So I need to do 3 squared first, which would be 9. So I'll have 9 minus 4 times 2 times negative 5.
And then it comes to
Ooh, sorry, I'm still on. Freaking out. Alright, so next we have x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 all over 2 times 2. So which one comes first? Subtraction or my multiplication? Multiplication. So I need to do this multiplication first before I subtract. So I need to figure out what's negative 4 times 2 times negative 5. It will be a positive 40. So negative 8 times negative 5 will give me a positive 40. So this is going to be plus 40 in there. So we have negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 plus 40, all divided by 2 times 2. Next, the last thing we can do in order to simplify that grouping, 9 plus 40 is just 49. All over 2 times 2. Are we doing okay so far? Following along? Oh, sorry, I forgot my plus or minus in there. Sorry about that. Now, do we know the square root of 49? 7. we know 2 times 2? I'll just get rid of that part and start simplifying that. You could, technically this is all grouping still. When you're working on that square root, that's still technically under the grouping part. But you can, the bottom part's not going to change anything until the very end. So if you multiply those 2 numbers, 2 times a at the very beginning, that's fine. If we put 4 way up here, that's still fine. It'll still get you the same answer. So the reason we have this plus or minus in there, last week we had talked about when you take the square root, you can get a positive solution, but you can also get a negative solution. The square root of 25 could be 5, or it could also be negative 5. And so that's why we have this plus or a minus, because the square root of 49 could be positive 7, or it could also be negative 7. So once we get to this part, we are now going to split into 2 problems. Because once again, we want those 2 solutions. We have those 2 spots where a quadratic hits the x-axis, so we need 2 solutions. So one of my solutions is going to be x equals negative 3 plus 7 divided by 4. And the other solution is going to be x equals negative 3 minus 7 divided by 4. So when you get to that spot where you have those 2 numbers that are added or subtracted by that plus or minus, you're going to split up into 2 problems. One we're using the addition, one we're using the subtraction. So once again, we want those 2 spots where we cross that x-axis. And from here, we can just solve one, get your answer, and then solve the other, get the answer. So what is negative 3 plus 7?
Negative 10.
Negative 3 plus 7.
4.
It'll be 4. And then 4 divided by 4?
1.
Just 1. So x equals 1. That is one of my solutions. That is one of my x-intercepts that we talked about earlier. And I can do the exact same thing with the other one. Now I have to think, what's negative 3 minus 7? Negative 10. And then negative 10 divided by 4 is going to give us, like, I think it's negative 0.2, or negative 2.5. Or if you want to keep it as a fraction, you can keep it as negative 5 over 2, same answer. Or you can figure out what the decimal is. So this is a lot of work. We did a lot of math to get that. But once again, the faster or the more we do these, the faster you'll get. You'll start recognizing you'll be able to simplify that whole part under the square root easily, like very quickly in like one step, and then you'll be able to move on very quickly. Once again, last year's Algebra 1 students prefer this method overall, and this is typically the one that I see most students prefer. I know it's really intimidating at first and it's really scary at first, but the more we work with it, the easier it becomes. Are we okay with that so far? With that first one? Should we try doing another one? See another example? Okay. I think you should have this one as well next to it. So once again, the very first thing we did was we wrote down what is that A, B, and C for my problem. So what is A for this problem? 1. What's my B?
Negative 2.
And then lastly C. So we have A, B, C. And once we have this, we can do our opposite of B plus or minus square root B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. A whole quadratic formula, and we can start plugging in those values. So it's always x equals opposite of B. What's my B?
Negative 2.
Plus or minus the square root of B squared, so 2 squared, minus 4 times A times C all over 2A. So if you, really what we did, we just sort of skipped writing that whole formula down again, and we just skipped right to inputting the numbers in, which is fine. You don't have to write the whole formula down if you're comfortable with that. But if it's helpful to write the formula down to begin with, go for it. Yes, it would. Thank you for that. Awesome. Sorry, I made a mistake. So yeah, this should be a negative 2, which would make this a positive 2, which would make this a negative 2 squared. Thank you for that, Wyatt. You're more perceptive than I am. Are we okay with this so far? All right, so now that we have this full formula, now once again, it's just time to simplify things. So we'll go through. So once again, the very first thing you want to simplify is going to be under that square root. So negative 2 squared. What's negative 2 squared? So it's negative 2 times negative 2, which will give us positive 4. So it's positive 4 minus 4 times 1 times negative 8. All over 2 times 1, and I know 2 times 1. I can just put that down there. It's not going to change. That way I don't have to keep writing 2 times 1. I'm just going to simplify that to 2. So if you do this part on the bottom early, it won't change up your order of operations. Things will still be fine. Are we okay so far? All right, what should I do next? What does order of operations tell us next? So we're still working under that parentheses. We're still working on that under that square root. We still want to simplify everything under there first. The next step would be multiplying all of these together. So negative 4 times 1 is still negative 4. So negative 4 times negative 8, which would give me a positive 32. So once again, I'm just going to multiply this whole piece together. Remembering that's a negative 4, and I'm going to keep those signs in there as well. So it's a negative times a negative gives me a positive 32. So I have 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 plus 32 all over 2. Next, I'm still working under that square root. I'm still on that piece, so I'm going to just add those two together. 4 plus 32 will give me 36 over 2. So things are starting to get simplified. We're starting to get down. Square root of 36? 6. So we have x equals 2 plus or minus 6 divided by 2. Once again, we have that plus or minus there because the square root of 36 could be a positive 6 or it could be a negative 36, or it could be a negative 6. And once we get down to that step, we split into 2 problems once again. One where we're adding and one where we're subtracting. So it's x equals 2 plus 6 over 2, and x equals 2 minus 6 divided by 2. So we'll split into adding and subtracting. Then from here, we're just solving first part, just solving the second part. So what's 2 plus 6? 8. So 8 over 2, and that gives me just 4 as one of my x-intercepts. And then same thing for the other one. 2 minus 6, that's negative 4 over 2, and then negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. So we have our 2 solutions. Now you may have looked at this quadratic at the beginning. We had x squared minus 2x plus 8, I think, or minus 8. You might have saw that and was like, oh, that would be super easy to factor. We can just create our factor thing and solve it that way, and that's fine. If you prefer factoring, and if you recognize that that's a really easy one to factor, go for it and factor it. But I still want you to be able to know how to solve a quadratic formula just in case. Typically on your state test, they don't ask you specifically solve this by factoring or solve this by quadratic formula or solve this by complete the square. They'll typically just give you a quadratic and say, solve this quadratic. And so they give you the option on how to solve it. And so if you prefer factoring, use factoring. If you prefer quadratic formula, use quadratic formula. If you prefer complete the square, that we'll talk about on Wednesday, and do that one. But I want you to be able to sort of recognize. And there's some situations where factoring might be the easiest solution. There's some situations where quadratic formula might be the easiest solution. But are we okay with the steps we took on this?
Yeah.
Once again, it's a lot of steps. It's a big formula. But if you just work through it and simplify piece by piece, go, okay, what do I need to simplify next? What do I need to simplify next? And you can work through it, you'll start getting the hang of it. Any questions at the moment? All right. So right now, what I want you to do is I just want you to try to practice this. So you should have, I don't know if I put it on your formula or if I put the quadratic formula. Okay. So yeah, you have your quadratic formula on your sheet. I have it up here as well, just in case you need a quick refresher of what it looks like again. I can try to make that a little bit bigger. But figure out what is your A, B, and C, plug it into that formula, and see if you can start simplifying it. If you have questions on what the next step is or how to simplify something, let me know, and I will do my best to answer them.